Video is a sequence of frames played at a high rate in order to simulate motion. When you play a video game, frames are rendered on the fly and shown to you at a high rate. In a high-action game, that rate is oftentimes very important. A high frame rate can be the difference between life and death. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on Gameranx, we're going to ask the question, why is frames per second so important in video games? Way back in 1956, a video recorder sold for $50,000. A videotape cost $300 for an hour-long reel. And now you have a machine that literally synthesizes reality and displays it to you in rapid succession that costs $300 to $400. That's pretty amazing to think about. From that perspective, the frame rate itself might not even really sound that important, because relative to where we were 100 years ago, what we have now is amazing. Now, the definition of a frame rate is the number of still pictures per unit of time of video. Now, generally on television, you see video at a frame rate of 30 frames per second. In the movie theater, you see it at 24 frames per second, but the target for video games is generally 60. Now, there's actually more than one reason, but the first one I want to address is how much is going on in a video game. If you're playing a game like, say, Overwatch, you're going to find that things happen at a very fast pace. You have to make a lot of decisions very quickly, and you have to execute those decisions to the best of your ability in a short period of time. Now, regardless of the frame rate, you're always going to see the same action, however, it's going to be less smooth at a lower frame rate. Now, this isn't to say you can't play one of these types of games on a low frame rate, because you most certainly can. But the higher frame rate, the more information you have to work with in a single second. Your brain views 60 frames per second as much more similar to the actual world around you, because you're not seeing the world in a frame rate, you're seeing it at the speed of light. Now, your brain stops really being able to recognize much difference between the speed of light and video at around 60 frames per second, a 60 hertz refresh rate if you're talking about the television. Now, you might see arguments that 90 frames per second is the only place where you actually start to get that effect, but I disagree. Now, the brain can make decisions fairly quickly, and you can attempt to make a motion or an action or anything like that in a fairly short period of time. But every single frame per second less increases the delay between an input and an action on screen. Now, assuming you're literally only talking about an input lag because of frames per second, you get about 16 milliseconds at 60 frames per second. But at a film frame rate, 24 frames per second, it becomes a 42 millisecond input lag. And 42 milliseconds of input lag is noticeable, to say the very least, given the fact that your decision making can be affected by both the amount of information you're taking in every second. There can be major effects to the gameplay based on how many frames per second are being displayed. And that's not even getting into the math side of things. You see, most games do calculations based on the previous frame. Games are mostly coded to handle things based on a frame-by-frame basis, so they have to account for variable frame rates. Because if you drop a frame, that essentially makes it so those calculations have to be redone. Because if physics do something based on a frame that was just dropped, for one, there's nothing there, but if it goes on the frame before it, the physics are going to jump. This can be responsible for all sorts of things that are common in video games. For instance, we talked about this once, falling through the floor. Another thing that can happen is called temporal aliasing, the jagged edges, so to speak. When images temporally alias, it's because your brain can't quite comprehend exactly where an object is supposed to be. Remember, in real life, there is motion blur. And in low frame rate 24 frames per second movies, there's motion blur that doesn't look terribly different from real life. It's a little on the surreal side, but I think everyone's pretty much used to it at this point. Motion blur exists, and in a movie that sort of interpolates and smooths the type of motion that you would see. Whereas in a game, you may have a variable frame rate, and on top of that, you may just be in a weird number of frames per second that makes it look bad. Motion blur in a game can definitely help this, and a lot of games at 60 frames per second do have motion blur specifically to handle this type of a situation, but even without motion blur, 60 frames per second and up generally doesn't have this kind of problem. For instance, Doom has some of the best motion blur I've ever seen in a game, but it's still good to try to play it at a high frame rate because I've seen more than a few people who have stuck it at 24 frames per second, and frankly, two things happen. The first is I can't keep track of it as well. It's first person, it feels kind of weird. And second, I eventually get motion sickness from looking at it. Which begs the question, movies, why on earth do they even use 24 frames per second? And the reason is because it's industry standard and it provides a framework to create artwork. Film is art, and oftentimes, constrictions really help art blossom into something. The heavy motion blur associated with 24 frames per second films can actually allow for some pretty cool things, like fast pans between areas that otherwise aren't actually near each other. But in a video game, having a good sense of where you are and not whipping back and forth in between places that aren't actually near each other is weird, especially in a first-person game. Essentially, immersion is the short answer to why frames per second is so important in a video game. A high frame rate helps maintain a sense that you're actually there, or at least help you suspend the disbelief of not being there. And if you're attempting to make fast decisions and complete actions in very specific chains of events very quickly, you don't really want constant reminders that this is a fake world. And the various things that I've described in this video have a lot to do with just that. When things jolt you out of the world, you tend to mess up, get confused, or generally just lose your groove. And nobody wants that. And that's why game devs consider it so important. A well-optimized game avoids any of those issues. What do you think? And how fast does your computer allow you to play games at? Are you high-end, low-end? Does it even really matter to you? Let's talk about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please click like, and if you're not subscribed, please do so. You will not regret your subscription to Gameranx. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and we just want to say thank you very much for watching this one. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on Gameranx.